Millionaire sees homeless black girl crying at wife's grave. The truth shocks him. She knelt beside the marble headstone like she belonged there, her small fingers tracing letters on a grave that should have been visited by no one but him. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. The October wind cut through Riverside Memorial Cemetery like a blade, sending crimson leaves skittering across the manicured grounds of Chicago's most exclusive final resting place. Among the towering oaks and pristine headstones worth more than most people's homes, Theodore Blackwell pulled his Bentley to a stop along the winding path. At 62, Theodore carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. His charcoal suit, tailored on Savile Row in London, couldn't hide the weight he'd lost since Elizabeth's passing 6 months ago. The Forbes list called him the Steel King of the Midwest, but grief had hollowed him into something brittle. He stepped from the car, Italian leather shoes crunching on fallen leaves, and walked the familiar path to Section 7, Row 12. Elizabeth's grave sat beneath a weeping willow, marked by a headstone of imported Carrara marble that had cost more than most people earned in a year. Fresh white roses, delivered weekly by his assistant, lay pristine against the stone. Elizabeth Marie Blackwell, beloved wife. Her love was the foundation upon which dreams were built. Theodore had chosen those words himself, though they felt hollow now. What dreams remained when the dreamer was gone? But as he rounded the massive oak tree that shielded Elizabeth's resting place from the main path, Theodore froze. A small figure knelt beside his wife's grave. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, her dark skin a stark contrast against the white marble. She wore clothes that had seen better months, a faded purple jacket with holes in the elbows, jeans that were too short, and sneakers held together with duct tape. Her hair was plaited into 2 careful braids, though they were coming undone. What stopped Theodore's breath wasn't her presence, but her posture. She knelt with the reverence of someone who belonged there, someone who knew the person beneath that stone. Her small fingers traced the engraved letters of Elizabeth's name with the familiarity of ritual. "Elizabeth," the child whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I came back like I promised. I found some more pretty leaves for you." She placed a handful of colorful autumn leaves against the headstone, arranging them with the care of someone laying an expensive bouquet. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. Theodore's chest tightened. In 6 months of weekly visits, he'd never encountered another soul at Elizabeth's grave. Elizabeth had no living family, few close friends, and their marriage had been childless, a source of quiet pain they'd rarely discussed. Who was this child? And why did she speak to Elizabeth like she'd known her? "Excuse me," Theodore called out, his voice rougher than intended. The girl spun around, eyes wide with terror. She scrambled to her feet, clutching a worn backpack that appeared to contain everything she owned. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, backing away. "I wasn't hurting anything. I just came to talk to Miss Elizabeth." Miss Elizabeth. The words hit Theodore like a physical blow. Elizabeth had insisted their housekeeper, gardener, and staff call her by her first name, but she'd never mentioned anyone calling her Miss Elizabeth. Certainly not a child who looked like she lived on the streets. "Wait," Theodore said, raising his hands in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "I'm not angry. This was my wife's grave. Elizabeth was my wife." The girl stopped retreating, but suspicion clouded her features. Her dark eyes, intelligent, cautious, studied him like she was memorizing his face in case she needed to describe him to the police later. "You're Mr. Theodore," she said finally. It wasn't a question. Theodore's world tilted. This homeless child knew his name. I knew Elizabeth. Visited his wife's grave regularly enough to have a system for it. "How do you know me?" he asked, taking a careful step closer. The girl tensed but didn't run. "Miss Elizabeth showed me your picture. She said you were the kindest man in the whole world, even if you forgot to show it sometimes." The words were Elizabeth's. He could hear her voice in them. She'd said something similar to him just weeks before the cancer took her, during one of their late-night talks when pain kept her awake. "You have such a good heart, Teddy. You just keep it so well hidden that sometimes I think you forget it's there." "What's your name?" Theodore asked gently. The girl clutched her backpack straps tighter. "Amara." "Amara," Theodore repeated. The name was beautiful, musical. "How did you know my wife?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Her eyes darted toward the cemetery gates, calculating escape routes. Then she looked back at Elizabeth's headstone, and her rigid posture softened slightly. "She used to come to the park," Amara said quietly. "Lincoln Park, by the lake. She'd sit on the bench and read books. Sometimes she'd share her lunch with me and the other kids." Lincoln Park. Elizabeth had mentioned her walks there during her chemotherapy treatments, and said the fresh air helped with the nausea. But she'd never mentioned meeting homeless children. Never mentioned Amara. "She was sick," Amara continued, "but she was always smiling. She taught me to read better. Said reading was like having friends in your pocket." The girl's voice cracked. "She promised she'd get better. Said we'd read more stories together." Theodore felt something crack inside his chest. Elizabeth had been tutoring homeless children during her final months, sharing meals with kids who had nothing, keeping promises that cancer wouldn't let her fulfill. It was exactly like her. Generous, loving, giving until she had nothing left to give. And he'd known nothing about it. Have you ever discovered something that made you question everything you thought you knew about someone you loved? What was that moment like for you? The afternoon sun filtered through the willow branches, casting dancing shadows across Elizabeth's headstone as Theodore processed Amara's words. 6 months of grief had convinced him he'd known everything about his wife, every kindness, every secret. Yet here stood living proof of Elizabeth's hidden compassion, a child who mourned her with the same depth he did. "She promised she'd get better," Amara repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "But she stopped coming to the park. I waited every day for weeks." Theodore's throat constricted. Those final weeks when Elizabeth could barely leave bed, when the treatments had failed and hope became a cruel joke they both stopped telling. He'd been so consumed with doctors and specialists and experimental treatments that he'd never asked about her walks, never wondered who might be waiting for her in Lincoln Park. "When did you last see her?" he managed to ask. "March," Amara said, counting on her fingers. "Right before the flowers started growing. She gave me this." The girl reached into her backpack and pulled out something that made Theodore's knees nearly buckle. A small silver bracelet, delicate and worn, with a tiny heart-shaped locket dangling from it. His hands shook as recognition crashed over him like a wave. He knew that bracelet. Elizabeth had worn it every single day for 30 years. It had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations. She'd clutched it during her worst chemo sessions, rubbed the little heart when she was afraid. It had been buried with her. Theodore had specifically requested it, one final gift to accompany her into whatever came next. Or so he'd thought. "Where did you get that?" The words came out sharper than he intended, and Amara flinched. "Miss Elizabeth gave it to me," she said defensively, clutching the bracelet to her chest. "She said it would keep me safe. Said it had magic in it because it was full of love." Theodore stared at the bracelet. Unmistakably Elizabeth's, unmistakably real. His wife had given away her most precious possession, the one thing that connected her to family, to home, to the woman who'd raised her after her parents died. She'd given it to a homeless child. She said. Amara's voice grew smaller, more uncertain. She said I reminded her of someone. Someone she loved very much but couldn't. The girl trailed off, confusion clouding her features. Couldn't what? Theodore asked, though his heart was already racing toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. She started crying when she gave it to me. Happy crying, she said, but also sad crying. She held my face like this, Amara demonstrated, cupping her own cheeks with small hands, and she said I had her eyes. The world went silent. Theodore heard nothing. Not the wind through the trees, not the distant traffic from Lakeshore Drive, not his own ragged breathing. Everything faded except the child standing before him, the bracelet in her hands, and words that rewrote everything he thought he knew about his wife. I had her eyes. Elizabeth's eyes had been dark brown, almost black, with flecks of gold that caught the light when she laughed. Distinctive eyes, beautiful eyes, eyes that he'd fallen in love with 43 years ago when they were both students at Northwestern University. Eyes exactly like the ones staring at him now from Amara's face. "What's your last name?" Theodore asked, his voice hoarse. "Don't get one," Amara replied. "Just Amara. That's what they called me at the group home before I left." "How old are you?" 9, I think. Maybe 10. Miss Elizabeth said I was smart for my age. 9 or 10. Elizabeth had died 6 months ago. If this child was really... "Amara," Theodore said carefully, "do you know anything about your mother? Your father?" The girl's face shuddered closed, and Theodore recognized the look, the same expression Elizabeth wore when painful memories surfaced. "Mama died when I was little," Amara said flatly. "Never had no daddy. The lady at the home said my mama was real young, and real sick and real sorry." Theodore's chest felt like it was caving in. The timeline was impossible, but those eyes, and Elizabeth's reaction, and the bracelet she'd sworn would be buried with her. "Amara," he said gently, "what was your mother's name?" The girl hesitated, then whispered. "Mama's name was Grace. Grace Elizabeth Johnson. Grace Elizabeth." Theodore gripped Elizabeth's headstone to keep from falling. Grace had been Elizabeth's middle name, the name she'd always said she'd give to a daughter if they'd been blessed with one. Elizabeth Johnson had been her maiden name before they married. The truth hit him like lightning. This wasn't just a homeless child Elizabeth had befriended in the park. This wasn't charity or kindness or even the desperate attempt of a dying woman to leave some good in the world. This was Elizabeth's granddaughter, the daughter of a daughter they'd never known existed. Theodore stared at Amara, really looked at her for the first time. Beyond the worn clothes and dirt-smudged face, beyond the defensive posture and street-smart wariness, he saw Elizabeth's stubborn chin, her elegant hands, the way she tilted her head when thinking. He saw 30-year-old photographs come to life, his wife's features reflected in a child who carried her blood. "Oh my God," he breathed. Amara backed away, frightened by whatever she saw in his face. "I didn't steal anything. Miss Elizabeth gave it to me. She said I could keep it always." "No, no," Theodore said quickly, reaching out instinctively. "You didn't steal anything. You, Amara, you're..." How do you tell a homeless child that she's the granddaughter of a woman who died believing she'd never have family beyond her husband? How do you explain that the woman who showed her kindness in a park was actually her grandmother, searching unconsciously for the connection that biology had created but circumstances had hidden? Your family, Theodore whispered. You're Elizabeth's family. And that makes you mine. Theodore stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, staring out at the glittering lights of Chicago's Gold Coast. The city sprawled beneath him like a constellation, but all he could see was Amara's tear-stained face and the way she'd touched Elizabeth's headstone with such reverence. The crystal tumbler in his hand held 2 fingers of 30-year-old Macallan, but it remained untouched. His reflection in the glass looked haggard, older than his 62 years. This is ridiculous, he muttered to himself, the words echoing in the cavernous living room. The space was a monument to success. Italian marble floors, museum-quality art, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. But tonight it felt like a mausoleum. He'd driven straight home after the cemetery encounter, his mind spinning with questions. Elizabeth had been tutoring homeless children? Sharing meals with them? For how long? And why hadn't she told him? The rational part of his mind, the part that had built Blackwell Industries into a billion-dollar empire, insisted there was a logical explanation. Elizabeth had been naturally compassionate, maybe too compassionate for her own good. She'd probably felt sorry for some street kids and helped them out. That was all. But the way Amara had known his name, had spoken about Elizabeth with such intimacy, it felt like more than casual charity. Theodore pulled out his phone and scrolled to his assistant's number. Margaret would know. She'd handled Elizabeth's schedule, her appointments, even her personal errands during the final months. His thumb hovered over the call button. Then he stopped. What exactly would he ask? Margaret, did my wife have a secret life helping homeless children that she never bothered to mention to her husband of 23 years? It sounded paranoid. Pathetic. He set the phone down and took a sip of whiskey, letting it burn away the tightness in his throat. The problem wasn't just that Elizabeth had kept something from him. The problem was that it made perfect sense. During her final months, when the chemotherapy had stolen her appetite and energy, when she'd insisted on taking those long walks despite his protests, she'd seemed lighter somehow, purposeful. He'd attributed it to acceptance, to making peace with her diagnosis. Now he wondered if she'd found something else entirely, a reason to keep fighting, keep living that had nothing to do with him. The realization stung more than he wanted to admit. Theodore walked to Elizabeth's study, a room he'd barely entered since her death. Her books still lined the shelves, her reading glasses folded neatly on the antique desk. Everything exactly as she'd left it. He opened her desk drawer, not sure what he was looking for. Elizabeth's daily planner lay inside, the pages filled with her careful handwriting. Appointments, reminders, grocery lists, normal wife things. But as he flipped through the final months, a pattern emerged. Every Tuesday and Thursday, LP 2 o'clock. Lincoln Park. The same times Amara had mentioned. Theodore's hands shook as he turned the pages. There were other notations too. Books for A, extra sandwiches, reading assessment progress. For Amara. His wife had been planning her sessions with this homeless child, tracking her progress, caring about her development. These weren't casual encounters. They were appointments, commitments, relationships. Theodore slammed the planner shut, his chest heaving. Elizabeth had built a life he knew nothing about, formed connections that somehow mattered more than their marriage. While he'd been focused on quarterly reports and board meetings, she'd been out in Lincoln Park, being the mother she'd never been able to be. The mother they'd never been able to be. The whiskey tumbler hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, amber liquid spreading like a stain. Theodore didn't bother to clean it up. He was being irrational. He knew that. Elizabeth had been dying. Of course she'd wanted to do something meaningful with her remaining time. Of course she'd been drawn to helping children, given their own struggles with infertility. But the betrayal felt real anyway. In her final months, when he'd wanted to hold on to every moment together, she'd been sharing her time with strangers. With a homeless girl who now knew more about Elizabeth's heart than her own husband did. Theodore's phone buzzed. A text from his driver. Car ready for dinner reservations at Gibson's, Mr. Blackwell. Right. The quarterly dinner with the Pemberton Group investors. 3 hours of small talk and strategic positioning at Chicago's most exclusive steakhouse. The kind of evening Elizabeth had tolerated but never enjoyed. She'd rather be reading to homeless kids, he thought bitterly. He texted back. Cancel. Reschedule for next week. Within minutes, his phone rang. Margaret, his assistant. Her voice professionally concerned. Mr. Blackwell, is everything all right? The Pemberton dinner has been on your calendar for months. I'm fine, Margaret. Something came up. Should I send your regrets? They'll want an explanation. Theodore almost laughed. What explanation could he give? That he'd discovered his dead wife's secret life and was having an existential crisis in his penthouse? Tell them I'm feeling under the weather, he said. Of course. Is there anything else you need? Theodore hesitated. Margaret, during Elizabeth's final months, did she ever mention working with children? Tutoring, maybe. A pause. Not specifically to me, Mr. Blackwell, but she did ask me to purchase children's books several times. I assumed they were donations to her charity work. More secrets. More evidence of a life he'd been blind to. Which charity, he asked. I'm not sure. She handled those donations personally. Should I research it? No, Theodore said quickly. That won't be necessary. After he hung up, Theodore stood alone in Elizabeth's study, surrounded by the remnants of a woman he'd apparently never fully known. The city lights beyond the windows seemed to mock him. All those people living their lives, forming connections, while he'd been isolated in his tower of success. Tomorrow he will return to the cemetery. Not to visit Elizabeth, but to find Amara again. He needed answers, needed to understand what his wife had given this child that she couldn't give him. But deep down, in the part of his heart he rarely acknowledged, Theodore knew he wasn't just seeking answers. He was seeking the piece of Elizabeth that Amara still carried. The antiseptic smell of Northwestern Memorial Hospital hit Theodore like a wall as he carried Amara through the sliding glass doors of the emergency department. Her small body felt impossibly light in his arms, her breathing shallow but steady. The triage nurse took one look at the well-dressed man holding a clearly malnourished child and immediately called for a wheelchair. What happened? The nurse asked, her practiced eyes already assessing Amara's condition. She collapsed, Theodore said, his voice strained. She's been living on the streets. I don't think she's eaten in days. Within minutes, they had Amara in a curtained-off bay, for fluids flowing into her tiny arm. The doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Dr. Martinez, spoke in hushed tones about dehydration, malnutrition, and the need for observation. Are you family? Dr. Martinez asked Theodore. The question hung in the air like smoke. Theodore looked down at Amara, who was awake now but groggy from the 4 medications they'd given her for anxiety. Her dark eyes found his, and in them he saw a mixture of fear and hope that made his chest ache. He began, then stopped. What was he? A stranger who'd found her at his wife's grave? A wealthy man with no legal right to make decisions for this child? I'm the one who brought her in. There's no one else. Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes on her chart. Child services will need to be contacted. She'll need a placement while we work on getting her healthy. No. Amara's voice was weak but fierce. She struggled to sit up, pulling at the 4 line. Please don't call them. They'll separate me from Lily. Who's Lily? Theodore asked, moving closer to the bed. My little sister, Amara whispered, tears streaming down her face. She's only 5. I left her at the shelter, told her I'd be back. If they take me away, she'll think I abandoned her like everyone else did. Theodore felt something twist in his gut. There was another child, younger, more vulnerable. And Amara, at barely 9 years old, had been taking care of her. Where are your parents? Dr. Martinez asked gently. Amara's face went blank, the practiced expression of a child who'd learned that some truths were too heavy for adults to handle. Gone, she said simply. Theodore found himself pulling out his phone before he'd consciously made the decision. What's the name of the shelter? He asked. Cornerstone Mission, Amara said. On West Madison Street. But they close the doors at 8, and if you're not there. She didn't need to finish. Theodore was already dialing his assistant. Margaret, I need you to do something urgent, he said when she answered. There's a shelter called Cornerstone Mission on West Madison. There's a 5-year-old girl named Lily there. I need you to go there immediately and make sure she's safe. Tell them her sister is in the hospital and I'm covering any expenses needed to keep her secure until morning. He could hear Margaret's confusion through the phone, but she'd worked for him for 15 years and knew better than to ask questions when he used that tone. Consider it done, Mr. Blackwell, she said. Theodore hung up and found both Dr. Martinez and Amara staring at him. You did that for me? Amara asked, her voice small. Your sister needs to know you're okay, Theodore said. And you need to know she's safe so you can focus on getting better. Dr. Martinez cleared her throat. The 4 fluids will take several hours to complete. She'll need to stay overnight for observation, possibly longer depending on her blood work results. I'll stay with her, Theodore said without thinking. Sir, visiting hours end at 9, and only family members can. Then I'll pay for a private room, Theodore interrupted. Whatever it costs. She shouldn't be alone. Dr. Martinez looked between them, clearly trying to piece together their relationship. Finally, she nodded. I'll see what I can arrange. As the doctor left, Amara turned to study Theodore's face. Why are you being so nice to me? Most people, when they see kids like me and Lily, they just look away. Theodore pulled the uncomfortable plastic chair closer to her bed and sat down. Your sister Lily, he said. Tell me about her. Amara's face lit up despite her exhaustion. She's the smartest 5-year-old you ever met. She can already write her name and count to 100. She loves stories. I tell her one every night before we go to sleep. She's got these big brown eyes, and when she smiles, it's like sunshine. How long have you been taking care of her? Amara's expression clouded. Since our mama died 2 years ago. We were in foster care for a while, but they kept trying to separate us. Lily cried every night. So we ran away. I figured we'd be better together on the streets than apart in homes where nobody wanted us. 2 years. This child had been surviving on the streets of Chicago for 2 years, keeping herself and a toddler alive through 2 brutal winters. Theodore had seen grown men with business degrees crumble under less pressure. Miss Elizabeth, Amara continued quietly. She was the first person who didn't try to call someone on us. She just sat and talked to us like we were real people. She said every child deserved someone who saw their worth. Elizabeth's voice echoed in Theodore's memory. Children aren't problems to be solved, Teddy. They're people who need to be seen. They'd had that conversation 3 years ago when he'd dismissed her suggestion that they volunteer at a children's charity. He'd been too busy with mergers and acquisitions to think about hungry kids in his own city. She gave me this, Amara said, pulling something from her backpack. It was a small, worn book, Charlotte's Web, with Elizabeth's neat handwriting on the inside cover. For Amara, who takes care of everyone around her. Remember, you are loved. Miss Elizabeth. Theodore's vision blurred. Elizabeth had given this book to a homeless child while fighting cancer, and had taken time to write an inscription meant to carry this little girl through dark nights. On the street, a nurse came in to check Amara's IV, and Theodore stepped out into the hallway to call Margaret again. The little girl is secure, Margaret reported. I spoke with the shelter director. Lily is asking for her sister, but she's safe. Sir, if I may ask, what's this about? Theodore looked through the doorway at Amara, who was fighting sleep despite her exhaustion, clearly afraid that if she closed her eyes, this safety would disappear. I'm not entirely sure yet, he admitted. But Elizabeth would have wanted me to help them. Mrs. Blackwell did have a soft spot for children, Margaret said gently. Should I arrange anything else? Yes, Theodore said, making another decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. Call Dr. Harrison, Elizabeth's oncologist. Ask him to recommend the best pediatric doctors in the city. And Margaret, clear my calendar for the next few days. All of it, sir. All of it. When he returned to Amara's bedside, she was still awake, watching the IV drip with the fascination of someone who'd never had medical care. Mr. Theodore, she said, will you really make sure Lily's okay? I promise, he said. And when you're feeling better, we'll go see her together. Why? The question was direct, honest. You don't know us. We're nobody. Theodore thought of Elizabeth, of her secret generosity, of the children she'd fed and taught and loved while he'd been buried in profit margins and board meetings. You're not nobody, he said firmly. And Elizabeth saw something special in you. I'm beginning to understand why. For the first time since he'd found her at the grave, Amara smiled. Just a small curve of her lips, but it transformed her entire face. Will you tell me about her? Amara asked. About Miss Elizabeth when she was happy? Theodore settled back in his chair, and for the next 2 hours, he told stories he hadn't shared with anyone. Stories of Elizabeth's laugh, her terrible cooking, her habit of talking to plants. Stories of how she'd made him believe he was capable of being better than he thought he was. And as Amara finally drifted off to sleep, Theodore realized something that shook him to his core. For the first time in 6 months, talking about Elizabeth hadn't felt like reopening a wound. It felt like honoring a legacy. Outside the hospital windows, Chicago's skyline glittered in the darkness, and Theodore found himself making silent promises to a sleeping child and a wife who would never hear them. But somehow he suspected she already knew. The elevator climbed 47 floors in silence. Amara pressed against the far corner like a trapped bird. Theodore's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Blackwell Tower. offering panoramic views of Chicago's glittering skyline and Lake Michigan beyond. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city sprawling endlessly in every direction. "This is where you live," Amara whispered, stepping into the marble foyer with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandelier. "Yes," Theodore said, watching her take in the opulence. The penthouse had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. 12,000 square feet of modern luxury worth $30 million. But seeing it through Amara's eyes, he felt only emptiness. Miss Elizabeth lived here too. She did. Theodore's voice caught. "Would you like to see her room?" Amara nodded solemnly, following him down the hallway lined with priceless artwork. Theodore opened the door to what had been Elizabeth's private study, a warm sanctuary filled with books, family photos, and the antique writing desk where she'd spent countless hours. Everything remained exactly as Elizabeth had left it. Theodore hadn't been able to bring himself to change a single detail. Amara gasped, rushing toward the desk. "That's Miss Elizabeth's special box." On the desk sat an ornate wooden jewelry box that had belonged to Elizabeth's grandmother. Theodore had never seen Elizabeth open it. She'd always called it private, full of memories and dreams. "She showed you this?" Theodore asked, confused. "Not inside," Amara said quickly. "But she told me about it. Said it held the most important things in her heart." She looked up at Theodore with those impossibly wise eyes. "She said someday when she was ready she'd show me what was inside." Theodore's hands trembled as he approached the desk. In 6 months, he'd avoided this room, unable to face Elizabeth's belongings. Now, with this child who'd known his wife in ways he apparently hadn't, he felt compelled to understand. Maybe. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe she meant for us to look together." The box was heavier than expected, its mahogany surface worn smooth by generations of handling. Theodore lifted the lid with reverence, half expecting it to be locked. Instead, it opened easily, as if it had been waiting. Inside were treasures that made Theodore's breath catch. Letters. Dozens of them, tied with faded blue ribbons. Photographs he'd never seen. A small velvet pouch. And at the bottom, a leather journal bound with a golden clasp. Theodore lifted the first bundle of letters with shaking hands. The return address made him stumble backward. Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. "What is it, Mr. Theodore?" Amara asked, concerned about coloring her voice. With numb fingers, Theodore untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The date was from 12 years ago, 2 years after he and Elizabeth had married. The official letterhead swam before his eyes as he read, "Dear Mrs. Blackwell, thank you for your inquiry regarding adoption services. We have several children in our care who would benefit from placement with a loving family. We understand that you and your husband have been hoping to adopt for some time." Theodore sank into Elizabeth's chair, the letter fluttering from his nerveless fingers. Adoption. Elizabeth had been researching adoption 12 years ago, and he'd known nothing about it. "Mr. Theodore?" Amara moved closer, worried. "Are you okay?" He picked up another letter, this one from a private adoption agency in Springfield, Illinois. Then another from Catholic Charities. Application forms, partially filled out in Elizabeth's careful handwriting. Home study requirements. Financial disclosures. All dated from years ago. All hidden from him. "She wanted children," Theodore whispered, the words torn from his throat. "She was trying to. Why didn't she tell me?" Amara climbed into the chair beside him, her small presence somehow comforting. Maybe she was scared. Theodore lifted the leather journal, his hand shaking so badly he could barely open it. Elizabeth's handwriting filled the pages. Her thoughts, her dreams, her pain laid bare in blue ink. March 15th. I found the most beautiful little girl today at the agency. Her name is Lily, and she has the biggest brown eyes. Theodore would love her spirit. She reminds me of myself at that age, full of questions and dreams. But how do I tell him? He works so hard, carries so much responsibility. What if he thinks I'm not enough anymore? June 3rd. Another doctor's appointment. Another "we'll keep trying" conversation. Theodore held my hand and said we had time, but I see the sadness in his eyes. He thinks it's his fault we can't conceive. How do I tell him that maybe adoption isn't second best? Maybe it's exactly what we're supposed to do. August 20th. I saw 3 children today who need homes. My heart is breaking. There are so many babies and kids who just need someone to love them. But Theodore seems so focused on building the company, on providing for our future family. What if he sees adoption as giving up? What if he thinks I've given up on us? Page after page revealed Elizabeth's secret longing, her fear of disappointing him, her growing conviction that they were meant to be parents, just not in the way they'd originally planned. October 12th. I'm going to tell him tonight. I've been carrying these applications for months, too scared to share my heart. But I saw a little boy today at the park who reminded me so much of Theodore as a child. Determined, proud, trying so hard to be strong. These children need us. And maybe we need them too. But the next entry was dated 3 months later. January 8th. I couldn't do it. Theodore came home so exhausted from the merger talks, so stressed about the company. He looked at me with such love and said, "Soon, Elizabeth. Soon we'll have our family." How could I tell him that I'd been trying to build that family for months? How could I admit that I'd been planning our future without him? Theodore's vision blurred as tears he'd held back for months finally broke free. Elizabeth had wanted to adopt, had spent years researching, planning, dreaming of children who needed homes. And her love for him, her fear of his reaction, had kept her silent. "Miss Elizabeth told me about wanting babies," Amara said softly. "She said her heart was big enough for lots of kids, but sometimes grown-ups make things too complicated." Theodore looked up sharply. "She talked to you about this?" Amara nodded. "When she was really sick, near the end. She said she had so much love saved up with nowhere to put it. Said maybe that's why God brought her to the park, to share it with kids like me who needed it." Theodore turned more pages, finding entries from Elizabeth's final months. "The chemotherapy is getting harder, but I found something beautiful today. There are children living on the streets near Lincoln Park. Babies who should be in school, kids who haven't eaten in days. I can't give birth to children, but maybe I can mother these forgotten ones. Maybe this is my purpose." Amara asked me today why I don't have kids. I told her that sometimes the best families aren't born, they're chosen. She said she'd choose me for a mama if she could. My heart nearly broke from the beauty of it. I'm dying, and I never gave Theodore the family he deserved. But maybe I can still leave him something precious. Maybe I can show him that love isn't about blood. It's about choice. About opening your heart to someone who needs it. At the bottom of the box, Theodore found the velvet pouch. Inside was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. He opened it with trembling fingers and found 2 tiny photographs. One of himself as a young man, the other of a little girl with familiar dark eyes and careful braids. Amara gasped. That's me. Miss Elizabeth took that picture with her special camera. Theodore stared at the locket, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Elizabeth had carried his picture and Amara's picture together, next to her heart. She'd been building a family in secret, one homeless child at a time, while he'd been building an empire. She loved you, he whispered to Amara. She wanted you to be her daughter. Amara's eyes filled with tears. She said she was gonna ask you about me. Said maybe we could all be a real family. But then she got too sick, and I never saw her again until... She gestured toward the window, toward the cemetery they'd left hours ago. Theodore pulled Amara into his arms, both of them crying now for the woman who'd loved them enough to dream of bringing them together, even when she knew she wouldn't live to see it happen. She did ask me, Theodore said, his voice thick with emotion. She's asking me right now. The elevator doors opened to reveal Theodore's penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, and Amara's sharp intake of breath was audible. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the living room, offering a panoramic view of Chicago's glittering skyline. The space was immaculate, all clean lines, expensive art, and furniture that belonged in magazines. "This is where you live," Amara whispered, stepping carefully onto the marble foyer as if her worn sneakers might damage something priceless. Theodore watched her reaction, seeing his home through her eyes for the first time in years. The wealth that surrounded him daily, the imported rugs, the crystal chandelier, the original Monet hanging above the fireplace, suddenly felt excessive, almost embarrassing. "It's too big," he admitted quietly. "Elizabeth always said we rattled around in here like marbles in a shoebox." Amara walked slowly into the living room, her fingers trailing along the back of a leather sofa that cost more than most people's cars. She stopped at the baby grand piano in the corner, pressing one key so softly it barely made a sound. "Miss Elizabeth played piano," she said. "Sometimes in the park, when they had those outdoor concerts. She'd hum along and teach me the melodies." Theodore's throat tightened. He'd bought Elizabeth that piano for their 5th anniversary, but arthritis in her hands had forced her to stop playing years ago. He hadn't known she still hummed those old songs. "Are you hungry?" he asked, needing to focus on something practical, something he could control. Amara nodded shyly. Theodore led her to the kitchen, a chef's dream with granite countertops and professional appliances he rarely used. He opened the massive refrigerator, staring at its sparse contents. Takeout containers, bottled water, wilted vegetables his housekeeper had bought weeks ago. "I should warn you," he said with the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "I'm not much of a cook. Elizabeth handled all the meals." "I can cook," Amara offered quietly. "Miss Elizabeth taught me. She said every person should know how to make something that tastes like love." Something that tastes like love. Theodore closed his eyes, hearing Elizabeth's voice in those words. She'd said the same thing to him once, early in their marriage, when he'd complained about her insistence on cooking Sunday dinners instead of dining out. "What would you like to make?" he asked. Amara surveyed the kitchen with the serious expression of a general planning battle strategy. "Do you have eggs?" "And bread. Miss Elizabeth taught me how to make French toast. She said it was your favorite." Theodore's chest constricted. French toast had indeed been his favorite, something Elizabeth made for him every Sunday morning during their first years together. They'd sit at the kitchen table in their modest apartment, reading different sections of the newspaper, sharing bites of perfectly golden toast drizzled with maple syrup. "I think we have those things," he managed. Working together, they created something that felt almost foreign in the sterile perfection of Theodore's kitchen warmth. Amara moved with surprising confidence, cracking eggs into a bowl and whisking them with cinnamon. She hummed while she worked, the same melody Theodore remembered Elizabeth humming during those long-ago Sunday mornings. Miss Elizabeth said cooking is like telling a story, Amara explained as she dipped thick slices of bread into the egg mixture. Every ingredient has something to say, and when you put them all together, they make something beautiful. Theodore found himself actually helping instead of just watching. He heated the pan, buttered the bread, even managed to flip a slice without breaking it. The kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and vanilla, and for the first time in months, the massive penthouse felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. They ate at the kitchen island rather than the formal dining room, sitting on high stools with their plates between them. The French toast was perfect, crispy outside, custardy within, sweet but not cloying. Theodore realized he was actually tasting food for the first time since Elizabeth's death. "This is exactly how she made it," he said softly. Amara beamed with pride. She said the secret ingredient was paying attention, not just to the cooking, but to the person you're cooking for. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan. The city lights began to twinkle below them, and Theodore found himself seeing Chicago's beauty again instead of just its emptiness. "Mr. Theodore?" Amara's voice was hesitant. "Just Theodore is fine," he said. "Or Teddy, if you like. That's what Elizabeth called me." "Teddy," she repeated, testing the name. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why didn't Miss Elizabeth ever bring you to the park? She talked about you all the time, but you never came with her." The question was innocent, but it cut deep. Theodore set down his fork, struggling with how to answer honestly without burdening a child with adult failures. "I was always working," he said finally. "Building my business, making deals, trying to make more money. I thought that was how I showed love, by providing, by making sure we had everything we needed." "But Miss Elizabeth didn't need more money," Amara said with the clear logic of childhood. "She needed you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their truth. Theodore had spent 35 years accumulating wealth, building an empire, creating a legacy. But in the process, he'd missed the small moments that actually mattered. The park walks, the impromptu reading lessons with homeless children, the quiet acts of kindness that had defined Elizabeth's character. "You're right," he admitted. "I was so busy trying to give her the world that I forgot to share mine with her." Amara reached across the island and placed her small hand over his larger one. Her palm was warm, her touch gentle but grounding. "She knew you loved her," Amara said with certainty. "She told me so. She said love isn't always about being there for the big moments. Sometimes it's about knowing someone would be there if they could." Theodore turned his hand palm up, carefully enclosing Amara's smaller one in his. This child, this wise, generous, remarkable child, was offering him absolution he didn't deserve but desperately needed. "Tell me more about her," he said. "About the Elizabeth you knew in the park." Amara's face lit up, and for the next hour, she painted pictures with words. "Elizabeth teaches a group of homeless children to identify different types of birds. Elizabeth shared her chemotherapy medications with other cancer patients who couldn't afford treatment. Elizabeth organized informal book clubs on park benches, using library books she'd check out in stacks. She always carried extra snacks," Amara said, giggling at a memory. "Not just for us kids, but for anyone who looked hungry. She'd pretend she'd packed too much for herself, so people wouldn't feel bad about taking food." Theodore listened to stories of a woman he'd lived with for decades but had never fully known. The Elizabeth that Amara described was the same loving person he'd married, but she'd had an entire life of quiet heroism that had flourished beyond the walls of their privileged world. She made everyone feel important, Amara continued, like their stories mattered. She remembered everything. If someone mentioned they had a job interview, she'd ask about it the next week. If someone's kid was sick, she'd check on them. She made us feel seen. As Amara talked, Theodore realized something profound was happening. The suffocating grief that had wrapped around him like chains was beginning to loosen. Not disappearing, he would always mourn Elizabeth, but transforming into something else. Something that felt like purpose. Amara, he said carefully, what happened to your family? How did you end up living on the streets? The light in her eyes dimmed slightly, but she didn't shut down the way she had at the cemetery. The trust they'd built over the past few hours created space for difficult truths. My mama died when I was 6, she said quietly. Cancer like Miss Elizabeth. We didn't have insurance, so by the time she got help, it was too late. I went to live with my aunt in Detroit, but she had her own kids and not much money. When she lost her job, she said she couldn't keep me anymore. What about your father? Amara shrugged with the practiced indifference of a child who'd learned not to hope for things that would never come. Never knew him. Mama said he was a good man who just wasn't ready to be a daddy. Theodore felt anger surge through him. Not at Amara or even her absent father, but at a system that could allow a brilliant, loving child to fall through the cracks so completely. So you came to Chicago? Took a bus with the money Aunt Denise gave me. Thought it would be easier to disappear in a big city. That's where I met Miss Elizabeth. She found me crying in the park because I was hungry and scared. How long ago was that? Almost a year. She started bringing me food every day, then books, then she taught me how to stay safe. She never tried to call the police or social services. She said sometimes people just needed time to figure things out. Theodore closed his eyes. While he'd been consumed with board meetings and profit margins, Elizabeth had been saving a child's life one day at a time. She'd been the mother she'd always wanted to be, just not in the way either of them had expected. She talked about you all the time, Amara said suddenly, especially when she got really sick toward the end. She was worried about leaving you alone. She was worried about me? Theodore's voice cracked. While she was dying, she said you forgot how to let people love you, that you built walls so high you couldn't see over them anymore. Amara's eyes were gentle, wise beyond her years. But she also said those walls weren't to keep people out. They were to keep your heart from breaking again. Again. Theodore stared at this perceptive child, wondering what Elizabeth had told her about his past, about the childhood that had taught him that love was temporary, that people left, that the only thing you could count on was what you built with your own hands. She said you just needed someone to show you it was safe to come out, Amara continued. Someone who wouldn't leave. The words hit Theodore like a revelation. He'd spent so many years protecting himself from loss that he'd forgotten how to accept love. Even from Elizabeth. Even from this extraordinary child who was offering him connection without conditions. Amara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. What if you didn't have to live on the streets anymore? What if you had a real home? Her eyes widened, hope and fear warring in her expression. What do you mean? I mean, Theodore said, the words feeling like a leap off a cliff. What if you stayed here? What if we took care of each other? For a moment, Amara didn't speak. Then tears began to stream down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming possibility. "Do you mean it?" she whispered. Theodore reached for her hands, holding them gently in his. "Elizabeth loved you. That makes you family. And family takes care of family." Amara launched herself from her stool and threw her arms around Theodore's neck, holding on like she might never let go. He wrapped his arms around her small frame, feeling something inside his chest crack open, not breaking but blooming. For the first time in months, Theodore Blackwell felt like he might survive his grief. More than that, he felt like he might actually live again. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Theodore's penthouse felt like an accusation. Below, Lake Michigan stretched endlessly, its surface reflecting the golden sunrise that had once brought him peace. Now it only reminded him of the lies. Amara sat at the marble kitchen island, carefully eating scrambled eggs while reading one of the children's books they'd picked out together at Barnes & Noble on Michigan Avenue. Her hair was freshly braided, her clothes new and clean. She looked like she belonged in this world of luxury, but Theodore knew better now. The DNA results lay on his desk in the study, delivered by courier an hour ago. He'd stared at the words until they burned into his retinas. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Theodore Blackwell was Amara's father. The child eating breakfast in his kitchen, the girl who'd been living on the streets while he slept in Egyptian cotton sheets, was his daughter. Elizabeth had known. Had to have known. "Mr. Theodore?" Amara's voice pulled him from his spiral. She was looking at him with those intelligent dark eyes that he now realized were shaped exactly like his mother's. "You look sad. Are you thinking about Miss Elizabeth again?" Sad. He was drowning in an ocean of betrayal, anger, and self-loathing, and she called it sad. "Amara," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need to ask you something important." She set down her fork, giving him her full attention. The trust in her expression was a knife in his chest. "Your mother," Theodore began, then stopped. "How did you ask an 8-year-old about adultery? About lies that had shaped her entire existence? Tell me about her. What did she look like?" Amara's face brightened. She was beautiful. Like a princess. She had skin like mine but lighter, and long pretty hair. She smelled like flowers. "Gardenias," she said. "She used to sing to me." Theodore's hands trembled. He remembered that perfume, and remembered buying it during his business trips to Atlanta 9 years ago. Remembered a woman with gardenia perfume and eyes that promised discretion. Keisha Williams, the marketing consultant who'd worked on his southern expansion. The woman who'd made him forget his wedding vows for 6 months of stolen afternoons and business dinners that turned into something else entirely. He'd ended it when Elizabeth's first cancer diagnosis came. Thrown himself into being the devoted husband, convincing himself the affair had been a momentary lapse. He'd never looked back, never contacted Keisha again. He'd never known she was pregnant. "She got sick when I was 6, Amara continued, oblivious to the war raging in Theodore's chest. "Really sick. She couldn't work anymore, and we lost our apartment. She tried to find you." The words hit like bullets. "What do you mean, tried to find me?" "She said my daddy was an important man in Chicago. She had pictures of you from newspapers. She called your office lots of times, but they said you were too busy. She wrote letters, but nobody wrote back." Theodore's vision blurred. His assistant had standing instructions to handle personal solicitations, meaning any attempt by former associates to contact him outside official channels. How many letters had been discarded? How many calls are dismissed as opportunistic attempts to exploit his wealth? When Mama got really sick, she made me promise to find you if something happened to her. She said you were a good man who just didn't know about me. She said you'd take care of me. The room spun. Keisha had died believing he'd abandoned them. His daughter had been alone on the streets because his own staff had blocked her mother's desperate attempts to reach him. But Miss Elizabeth found me first, Amara said softly. She was so nice. She said she knew you'd want to help if you knew about me. She promised she'd make sure we found each other. Elizabeth had known, had orchestrated their meeting at the cemetery, had been trying to unite him with his daughter before her own death. The anger came like a tidal wave. All those months of Elizabeth's secret trips to Lincoln Park. All those gentle conversations about children, about legacy, about the family they'd never had. She'd been managing his life, manipulating him, making decisions about his daughter without his knowledge or consent. His daughter had been homeless while Elizabeth played puppet master with their lives. She lied to me, Theodore said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Amara's face crumpled. Who lied? Elizabeth. The name tasted bitter now. She knew who you were. She knew you were my. He caught himself before saying bastard daughter, but the damage was done. She knew you were my child and she didn't tell me. But she was trying to help, Amara said, confusion and hurt warring in her expression. She said she had to find the right time, when you were ready to hear about it. Ready? Theodore's voice rose. My daughter was living on the streets, and she thought I needed to be ready? The betrayal consumed him. Elizabeth, the woman he'd worshipped, had been lying to his face for months, playing games with a child's life, making him fall in love with his own daughter without telling him who she was. And Amara, sweet, trusting Amara, had been part of it, had sat in his home, eaten his food, accepted his care, all while knowing exactly who she was, while he'd been the fool, the mark, the man being managed by his dying wife and his illegitimate child. You knew, he said, staring at Amara with new eyes. You knew I was your father and you didn't tell me. Amara shrank back. I wanted to. But Miss Elizabeth said I had to wait, that you needed time to. To what? To be manipulated? To be lied to? Theodore's voice echoed through the penthouse. How long were you planning to keep lying to me? I wasn't lying. Tears streamed down Amara's face. I just wanted you to love me first, before you knew it. Miss Elizabeth said sometimes people get scared when they find out about kids they didn't know they had. She said if you loved me as just Amara first, then. Then what? Then I'd be trapped. Then I couldn't say no. The words hung in the air like poison. Amara's face went white, and Theodore realized he'd just confirmed her worst fears, that he saw her as a burden, a trap, a mistake. I didn't mean, he started, but it was too late. Amara slid off the stool, backing toward the hallway. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I'm not supposed to be here. I'm sorry Mama couldn't find you before. I'm sorry Miss Elizabeth lied. I'm sorry I exist. She turned and ran toward the guest room where she'd been staying. Theodore heard the door slam, heard the sound of crying that cut through him like glass. He sank into a chair, staring at the DNA results that had destroyed everything. His daughter, his brilliant, beautiful, brave daughter, thought she was a mistake. His wife, the woman he'd built his life around, had been a stranger. And he was alone again, surrounded by luxury that felt like a prison, with the taste of his own cruelty burning in his throat. Outside, Chicago moved on, indifferent to the family that had just shattered on the 47th floor. Theodore sat alone in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, the city lights blurring through windows he hadn't bothered to clean since Elizabeth died. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight. Amara had been gone for 3 hours, and the apartment felt more empty than it had in the 6 months since he'd lost Elizabeth. His phone lay on the marble coffee table, Detective Morrison's number still displayed on the screen. One call. That's all it would take to have Amara picked up, placed back in the system that had failed her so completely. It would be the responsible thing to do, the legal thing. But Theodore couldn't bring himself to press the dial. Instead, he found himself staring at the DNA test results scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. The scientific certainty of those numbers mocked him. 99.97% probability of paternal relationship. Amara wasn't just some child Elizabeth had befriended in the park. She was his daughter. His and Elizabeth's daughter, given away in a moment of fear and weakness 16 years ago when they were barely adults themselves. How could we have been so wrong? The question had been tearing at him since Dr. Sarah Martinez had explained the truth in her office that afternoon. They'd spent decades believing they couldn't have children, mourning the family they thought they'd never have. Meanwhile, their daughter had been growing up in foster care, aging out of the system at 18, becoming pregnant, dying alone in a Chicago hospital while giving birth to Amara, their granddaughter. The child Elizabeth had unknowingly been teaching to read in those final months, sharing lunches with, making promises to. The universe's cruelest joke or its most beautiful gift. Theodore couldn't decide which. His hands shook as he picked up Elizabeth's final letter, the one she'd written to Amara that he'd been too angry to let her send earlier. Elizabeth's handwriting, weakened by chemotherapy but still elegant, filled the page with words of love and hope. My darling Amara, if you're reading this, it means God has called me home. But please know that meeting you was one of the greatest blessings of my final months. You reminded me that love isn't limited by time or circumstance. It's infinite, like the stars we used to count together in the park. Theodore closed his eyes, remembering the devastation on Amara's face when she'd run from the DNA clinic. The raw pain in her voice when she'd screamed that she didn't need another family to abandon her. 8 years old, and she already understood rejection better than most adults understood love. Just like I did at her age, Theodore thought. Before his own adoption by the Blackwells, he'd lived in 3 different foster homes, each placement ending with him being shuffled somewhere new. He knew the particular ache of hoping for belonging and having that hope crushed repeatedly. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become exactly the kind of man who could give Amara everything she'd never had, but only after she'd learned not to want it anymore. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window, and Theodore barely recognized the man he saw. When had he become so isolated? When had wealth and success become walls instead of bridges? Elizabeth had tried to tell him, in her gentle way, that he was hiding from the world. But he'd been too proud, too afraid of vulnerability to listen. Now he understood what she'd been trying to say. The buzzer from the lobby interrupted his thoughts. Theodore's heart jumped. Could it be Amara? But when he answered, the doorman's voice crackled through the intercom. Mr. Blackwell, there's a police officer here to see you. Detective Morrison. Theodore's blood turned cold. Morrison had found Amara. This was it, the moment when the choice was taken out of his hands. He could almost see it, Amara in the back of a police car, being driven to another temporary placement where she'd learn, once again, that she wasn't worth keeping. Send him up, Theodore said, his voice hollow. 5 minutes later, Detective Morrison stood in Theodore's living room, his expression grim. "Mr. Blackwell, I've been looking for the girl, Amara. I need to ask you some questions about your relationship with her." "Have you found her?" Theodore asked, surprised by how desperate he sounded. Morrison studied him carefully. "Not yet. But I've been doing some digging into her background. Theodore, this child has been through hell. 3 foster homes in 2 years, each one worse than the last. The system failed her completely." "I know," Theodore said quietly. "Do you?" Morrison leaned forward. "Because I'm trying to understand something here. You're telling me you just discovered this girl is your granddaughter today, but you've been financially supporting her medical care through the Northwestern Memorial Children's Foundation for months. Anonymous donations, but the paper trail leads back to your corporate accounts." Theodore's head snapped up. "What?" "Elizabeth Blackwell set up a fund for disadvantaged children's medical care 6 months before she died. The primary beneficiary has been Amara Johnson. Cancer treatments, counseling, educational support. Nearly $50,000 so far." The room seemed to spin around Theodore. Elizabeth had known. Somehow, during those months of meeting Amara in the park, Elizabeth had figured out who she was. And instead of telling him, she'd quietly made sure their granddaughter was cared for. "She knew," Theodore whispered. "Elizabeth knew who Amara was." Morrison nodded. "The foundation paperwork includes a letter from your wife, to be opened only if something happened to the child. Want to guess what it says?" With trembling hands, Theodore took the sealed envelope Morrison offered him. Elizabeth's handwriting on the outside read, "For Amara's guardian, when love finds its way home." Inside, Elizabeth's words were clear and certain. "To whoever is caring for our granddaughter, yes, our granddaughter, please know that every choice Theodore and I made was born from love, even when that love was misguided. We gave away our daughter because we thought we weren't ready to be parents. We spent decades believing we couldn't have children because we were too proud to admit our mistake. But love has a way of bringing families together, even across years and heartbreak. If Theodore is reading this, then Amara has found her way to you, as I always prayed she would. Don't let pride keep you from the family you were meant to have. Our granddaughter needs you, but more than that, you need her. She will teach you what I've been trying to show you for 40 years. That love isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared. All my love, Elizabeth." Theodore sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. Elizabeth had orchestrated this entire reunion. Every lunch in the park, every reading lesson, every promise she'd made to Amara, it had all been leading to this moment. "She's been sleeping in Millennium Park," Morrison said quietly. "Groundskeepers found her this evening, but she ran before they could call social services. It's getting cold out there, Mr. Blackwell. Whatever you're going to do, you need to decide tonight." After Morrison left, Theodore stood at his window looking out over the city where his granddaughter was somewhere in the darkness, alone and afraid. In his reflection, he could see Elizabeth's photo on the mantel behind him, and for a moment, he could almost hear her voice. "Love isn't about being ready, Teddy. It's about being brave enough to try." Theodore picked up his keys and headed for the door. He had a granddaughter to find. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the newly opened Blackwell Foundation Community Center, casting golden light across the bustling activity within. Located in the heart of Chicago's South Side, the building that had once housed an abandoned warehouse now hummed with life, laughter, and hope. Theodore stood in the main hall, watching children from the neighborhood work on art projects at tables donated by some of Chicago's finest galleries. The walls displayed their artwork alongside inspirational quotes, and in the center of it all hung a large portrait of Elizabeth, smiling the warm smile that had captured his heart 35 years ago. "Daddy, look what I made." The words still sent warmth flooding through his chest every time he heard it. Amara bounded up to him, her face glowing with pride as she held up a painting. Gone were the threadbare clothes and worn sneakers. She wore a bright yellow sundress, her favorite color she'd discovered, and new white sneakers that she kept meticulously clean. But more than her appearance had changed. The hollow look of hunger and fear had been replaced by the bright confidence of a child who knew she was loved, protected, and had a place in the world. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Theodore said, kneeling to her level to examine the painting properly. It showed two figures, one tall, one small, standing hand in hand before a large house. Above them, a woman with kind eyes watched from the clouds, smiling down. "That's us," Amara explained, pointing to the figures. "That's our house. And that's Miss Elizabeth watching over us, like she always does." Theodore's throat tightened with emotion. "She would be so proud of you. So proud of both of us." The adoption had been finalized 3 months ago, after a lengthy process that had tested every ounce of Theodore's patience and determination. Social workers had questioned his motives, his age, his ability to parent a young black girl as a white man in his 60s. But Amara had never wavered in her certainty about what she wanted. "He's my daddy," she'd told the judge with fierce conviction. "He chose me and I chose him. Miss Elizabeth brought us together because she knew we needed each other." And she'd been right. In the months since that October day at the cemetery, both their lives had been transformed. Theodore had discovered that his vast wealth meant nothing compared to the sound of Amara's laughter echoing through his Winnetka mansion. He'd converted Elizabeth's art studio into Amara's bedroom, painted purple at her request, and filled it with books, hundreds of them, because she'd inherited Elizabeth's love of reading. "Mr. Blackwell." Theodore turned to see Maria Santos, the center's director, approaching with a warm smile. A former social worker from the Austin neighborhood, she'd been Theodore's first hire when he decided to channel his grief into something Elizabeth would have approved of. "The lunch program is ready to start," Maria said. "We're expecting about 200 kids today." The lunch program had been Amara's idea. "Miss Elizabeth always said hungry kids can't learn well," she'd told him one evening as they worked on her homework together. "Maybe we could make sure nobody's hungry anymore." So they had. The center now served free meals to any child who needed them, no questions asked. They offered tutoring, job training for parents, health services, and childcare. It was everything Elizabeth would have built herself if she'd had the time. "Daddy, can I help serve today?" Amara asked, tugging on his sleeve. "Of course you can," Theodore said, ruffling her hair. "But remember what we talked about? No sneaking extra cookies to kids," she recited with a grin. "Even though they really want them." They walked together toward the dining area, and Theodore marveled again at how natural this felt. He'd spent decades believing he wasn't cut out for fatherhood, that his demanding schedule and emotional walls made him unsuitable for children. But Amara had seen through all of that to the man Elizabeth had always known he could be. The lunch rush was controlled chaos. Kids from ages 5 to 15 lined up with their trays, chattering in English and Spanish, their faces bright with anticipation. Many of them had been living the same way Amara had. In shelters, in cars, in apartments with too many people and too little food. Theodore took his usual position at the serving station, ladling mac and cheese onto plates while Amara distributed rolls. He'd learned all their names, their stories, their dreams. There was Miguel, who wanted to be a veterinarian. Jasmine, who wrote poetry. David, whose mother worked 3 jobs but still couldn't always keep food on the table. Each child reminded him of Amara that first day, vulnerable, brave, deserving of so much more than the world had given them. "Mr. B," called out Destiny, a 7-year-old with gap-toothed smile. "Miss Amara says you used to be really sad. Is that true?" Theodore glanced at Amara, who shrugged unapologetically. She'd never learned to filter her thoughts, a trait he was learning to appreciate. "It's true," Theodore said honestly. "I was very sad for a long time. But not anymore." Destiny pressed. Theodore looked around the bustling center, at Maria coordinating volunteers, at teenagers helping younger kids with their homework, at parents attending GED classes in the back room. Then he looked at Amara, who was making silly faces at a shy 5-year-old to get him to smile. "Not anymore," he said. "Sometimes the best things happen when you're not looking for them." After lunch, as volunteers cleaned up and families began to head home, Theodore and Amara walked to their favorite spot, the reading corner Elizabeth's Memorial Fund had sponsored. Comfortable chairs surrounded a small collection of Elizabeth's favorite books, and her portrait watched over it all. "Read to me," Amara asked, settling into the chair beside him. It had become their tradition. Every day, after the center's activities wound down, they would sit together and read. Sometimes Amara read to him, her voice growing stronger and more confident every day. Sometimes he read to her, discovering that he had a talent for different character voices that made her giggle. Today, she'd chosen The Secret Garden, a story about a lonely girl who discovers beauty and belonging in an unexpected place. As Theodore read about Mary Lennox finding her way in a new world, he felt Elizabeth's presence as strongly as if she were sitting beside them. He could almost hear her voice, warm with satisfaction. "You found each other just like I knew you would." The sun was beginning to set over Chicago's skyline when they finally packed up to leave. Amara ran ahead to the car, chattering about her plans for tomorrow, a field trip to the Lincoln Park Zoo, followed by dinner at their favorite restaurant in Little Italy. Theodore paused at the entrance, looking back at the bustling center that had become the heart of their shared mission. Above the doorway, bronze letters spelled out the building's dedication: Elizabeth Marie Blackwell Community Center, where love builds bridges. It was perfect. Elizabeth had always believed that love could bridge any gap, between races, classes, backgrounds, or circumstances. She'd proven it by bringing a grieving millionaire and a homeless little girl together at exactly the moment they needed each other most. "Daddy, come on." Amara called from the car. "You promised we'd stop for ice cream." Theodore smiled, the expression coming as naturally now as breathing. "Coming, sweetheart." As they drove through the Chicago streets toward home, Amara's hand in his, Theodore realized that Elizabeth had given him the greatest gift possible. Not just Amara, but the chance to become the man she'd always seen in him. A father. A protector. Someone who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in stock portfolios or real estate holdings, but in the love that connected one heart to another. "Thank you, Elizabeth," he whispered to the evening sky. "Thank you for bringing her to me." And somewhere in the space between earth and heaven, he could swear he heard Elizabeth's laughter, warm with joy and the satisfaction of a promise finally fulfilled. The little girl who'd knelt at a stranger's grave, tracing letters with loving fingers, had found her way home. And the man who'd built walls around his heart had learned that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do is tear them down. They were family now, not by blood but by choice, not by chance but by love. And that made all the difference. What bridges have love built in your own life? Share a story about an unexpected connection that changed everything for you. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.